Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at Scottish Summit and my session, Repeatable Database Deployment to Azure using PowerShell, and I'm Annette Allen. Firstly, I'd like to thank our sponsors, without which the event is going to be much harder to take place. So if you can go and chat to them in their virtual environments, that would be great, please. Thank you. As I said, I am Annette Allen. I've been working with SQL Server for over 20 years. I'm currently a DBA stroke developer for World Data Limited, who do outsourced database administration. I'm also actively involved in the community and have been for about 10 years. You may have seen me at SQL Bits behind the desks there. So what are we going to be talking about today? In a previous role, I had to come up with a solution to deploy the same database structure to multiple Azure SQL databases across multiple regions, but that had region-specific data. For example, it could be that the data was in a different language or just a subset of the data set. Imagine this scenario. You work for a global sports product manufacturer, in my case, my sports company, and you have franchises all over the world. All these franchises are linked to the headquarters databases for reporting purposes, but they do not all sell the same product, and they all want their own version of the central database. So in the UK, we sell all products. In Asia, we only sell bikes, and in America, we only sell clothing. The schema is the same for all, but the data, the products that we're selling, is different for each region. We needed to find a way to ensure that all databases were kept in sync regarding schema changes, but they only got the data that related to them. This process also needed to be able to be rerun multiple times with updating the changes, but there should be no risk of data loss or orphaned records. In this session, I'm going to show you how I solved this problem. I will demonstrate how to build an Azure SQL database and its surrounding environment, but the process can be used to deploy to any on-prem environment, and the theory would work deploying to any cloud-based solution. The process can be run multiple times. It will also only amend changes, or it will build as required. So the way I tackled this problem was to have a central database, in my case called Hub, which contained the environment information and the static data that needed to be deployed. I also had my sports database, which was the database I wanted to deploy. I stored that in my repo, and that needed to stay in sync. That contained all the schema information relating to the database I was building. From there, I needed to build a resource group and the SQL database. That had to hold static data that held products. It also needs to handle currency changes. So, for example, something that cost £50 in the UK wouldn't cost $50 in America. And it had to handle that. We also needed to be able to languageify things. So, for example, a product in America might be called something different to what it was over here in the UK. And certainly if we were selling to France or Germany that were in a different language, we needed to be able to handle that. So the data from my sports repo and my Hub database built the resource group and populated the SQL database. Remember, we couldn't use replication or mirroring or any other tool like that because the data was different for each region. So how did we do this? To start off with, I had to build the setup, and that was all done in SQL Server and was all database driven. Then we have to build or update the schema in the Azure SQL database, and that was done in PowerShell. Finally, we needed to be able to populate and update the data. Equally, once we had an environment built, it could be that data changed and we just wanted to update data, but we didn't need to update the schema. So these last two steps needed to be able to run independently to each other. So what tools did I use? I have a Git repo. I used Redgate SQL Source Control. I used Redgate's DLM Automation Tools. I'm using PowerShell 5.0 with the following modules, the SQL Server module and the AZ module. So let's have a look at how we did it. To start off with, we're going to be in SQL Server. And I will just swap my screens, if you just bear with me. So you can see here we're on my local laptop, which is called Baby Dell. and I'm on the Monza instance. Not that I'm an F1 fan, you understand. And we've got our hub database and our My Sports database. In our hub database, the leading table that we need is the locale table. Now you can see here that I've got a build schema. I keep that the same across the board because it shows that this is being used to build an environment. And when we get to the My Sports database, we also use the build schema because that shows that the data is populated from the source data and isn't populated by data entry in the region. So let's have a look at this build locale table. Oh, in the wrong database. There we go. So you can see here, I've got 4 environments already set up in here. Each one needs to have an individual locale ID, and we need to remember that because that's what we will use when we get to PowerShell. We need to know name the locale, and that will be used for all the naming conventions. It'll help us name the resource group, the server, and it also identifies what we're doing. So you can name this whatever you want. When we get to deploying it and using it as a naming convention, we'll remove the spaces. We need to have the Azure region so we know where we're going to build this. That needs to match exactly what Azure is expecting. And later on, when we go back to the slide deck, I'll show you a function that you can use that will call the regions, and you can make sure you know how that needs to look. We also need the username that you're using to connect to the Azure portal. One thing with this, we're assuming you already have a subscription set up. We don't create that we've already got it. Now, in this table, I do hold the subscription ID and the tenant ID. I've blanked these out for an obvious purpose within the demo, and for the purposes of the demo, we'll get them from files. But you can enter them in here, and then the information is already stored. The next bit of information is the tier, and that is the pricing tier of the SQL Server that we want to build. I've used the basic tier, which is the cheapest and smallest one available for demo purposes, and I always use that and then get bigger as we need to. Again, I will show you later on a link to Azure site that will show you what the different tiers are. I also flag up whether this is a live environment or not. The reason for this is that if later on you want to be able to rip down test environments, you don't want it to rip down a live environment. So by putting a flag in, you can say, okay, I want to rip this one out, but if it's flagged as live, don't touch it. And that gives you a bit of a fail-safe. So what we need to do is I've decided we are now moving into Australia. I wish I'd like to go out there and visit as well when the world gets back to normal. So to do that, I need to insert a new row with all my Australia information. And you can see here in line 11 down to 29 that I'm inserting the new rows. The Azure region is Australia East, and I've decided this is a test environment, and I'm going to call it Australia East Test. All the other information is the same. I would put in my subscription and tenant ID, and because it's a test, I'm not saying it's a live environment. So I'm just going to run that. And we've built it, and let's have another look at our table to prove it's entered all right. And you can see here, line 5, we've got locale ID 5. And as I say, need to make a note of that because we will be referring to it later on. The next thing we want to do is we need to know what data we're populating. So I'm going to copy the tables from the My Sports database, and they will be product, product category, and product subcategory. And you can see here that I've put them, as I said, in the build schema. Now, what I need to do is to be able to populate the data in the destination, I need these in my hub database. So what I have to do is create an exact copy of the My Sports build product and any other tables that I want to deploy data in to my hub database. I've already done this. And if we have a look at this, you can see that we've got them matching. Just scroll across. There's quite a few columns there. The next thing we need to do is link which products are going to which locale, which region. So to do that, we have a build locale product table. So we have a look at this, and you can see here that locale ID 1 has got all these products, and it goes on to the bottom, and you can see the ones that locale ID 4 has got. We've also got this column called local product name. Now, if, for example, as I said earlier, you wanted to name something slightly different in a different region, you could put it in this column and it would then take this data when we deploy. Now we use the store procedure for the deployment process, and I'll show you how to create that in a minute. So, but any change in here, we can do any change in the product name, we can put it in here. So now we want to say that Australia are getting bikes. So to do that, I'm going to put all the bike products into the locale product ID. So I've just selected some variable, set a variable of locale ID is 5 and the product category is bikes, and that will grab me all the information and insert them into the locale product table. It's also going to take the product categories and product subcategories for bikes so that we can populate them when we get there. So if we just run this code, if I press the right buttons, it would help. And it's going to populate our information. And you can see here we've got 97 products, 1 product category, which I would expect, we're only looking at bikes, and 3 product subcategories. And here we show all the product IDs for all the products that are bikes, and they're linked to locale ID 5. But we haven't changed any of the names. We can, we're not going to. The next thing we need to do is work out the currency. Obviously, what we sell a bike for in Australia is going to be different to what we will sell it for over here. So I've got a table called product price. And in here, you can see that locale ID 1, when we deploy the data, is going to be 1.25 times the current price. That was the conversion rate at the time of writing, which was the 1st of May 2020. And obviously, in the real world, we'd keep these up to date. So I've had a look and see what the conversion rate is for GP pounds to Australian dollars. And at time of writing, it was 1.785 dollars to the pound. So I'm just going to insert that into there. And now let's have a look at the product price table. And you can see now that we've got our locale ID 5 and it's 1.785 times. The next thing we have to do is we have to tell the PowerPoint which tables we want to deploy. So we list them in a table called table list. Very simple. And as I said, we're taking product category, and product subcategory. Now, because I like using store procedures with PowerShell, I've written a store procedure that just gets me the table name. So later on, when we have to tell it which tables we want to deploy, we can just call this store procedure. So we just need to run that. It's already created, so I'm not going to rerun it now. The next thing we have to do is for all 3 tables, we need to create a store procedure that says these are the columns that we need to deploy to this table in this region. Most important part to this is that the naming convention is right, because when we get to the PowerShell, we will dynamically build the name of this store procedure, because obviously we don't want to list them. We need this to be a dynamic execution. So I always put it again in the build schema, and it's get underscore build underscore and the table name. And I always pass in the locale ID so I know which locale I'm building. We then list all the columns that we want to deploy. So as I said, we will take the product name if we have one. This is in line 141 here. If there is no product name, we'll just take the name in the product table. And again, line 149 to 153. If we're joining here to the product price table, if there is no entry in the product price table for locale, then we'll take the current price. Otherwise, we will do the multiplication and multiply the list price with the product price, and that will give us our new currency value. And we're just joining the product to the locale product and then the product price and filtering it on the locale ID. So you can see now how we can build up this the store procedure to get the data that we need. So that is all we need to do the current setup. So now we will go to PowerShell and have a look at how that's working. Let me give us a bit more space here. Now I've built this as a function, and actually you can see here that I have 2 functions, build Azure database and populate setup data. They work individually, or you can run them one after the other. Obviously, we don't have this environment set up at the moment, so we're going to have to run them both. We need to build the environment, then we need to populate it. So let's go back to here and we'll go through the code that is going to do our build. Now I'm going to run this as I go, which is why I've got these commented out variables. So we will pass in the locale ID, we know that's 5. That's the Australia one that we've just set up. The source directory, where my repo is. The source server, Baby Del Monzo, as we've looked at. The source database, and that is where all my environment-specific information is, so hub database. The database we want to deploy is my sports. And I've got in here a directory path that's holding my passwords. So my passwords are encrypted and stored in files. You can deal with your passwords in the way that you're most comfortable with. This is just what I've done for demo purposes. So we'll add them. Then we have to load all the necessary functions. So that's all we're doing here. Now we have to start doing some stuff. So the first thing we need to do is go and get the locale specific information. So if we have a look at that function first, so all we're doing is using a function to go and get the information that we've just populated in the locale table. And that's all this function is going to do. I prefer to use functions wherever I can, because if you're going to need to do it again, it may as well be in a function and you can call it from multiple places. So we will call that. And if we have a look down here and just return the data, you can see it's returning the information that we've returned from that function. We then need to set the variables to hold that information. As you can see in line 41, the database I'm converting to a lowercase. In some places, I have noticed with Azure that it is case sensitive when you're joining. So I set them to a case that I know, and then I can always make sure that it's the way I'm expecting it. The next thing we have is this ABR name, abbreviated name. So this is how we're using it for the naming convention. So we're going to use the locale name, and if we have a look, we can see what the locale is stored for, and it should be my Australia East test. And we're going to replace the spaces with nothing. For the server name, we're going to add the word server on the end. For the full server name, sometimes when you have to do some of the connection strings, you need the .database.windows.net, so I add that in. When you create the SQL Server, you have to give it an admin username and password. So I'm setting my admin username to be admin user. I'm setting the server name to be lowercase, and when we connect to the SQL Server, it's going to have in the full connection string, which is the TCP with the port number at the end. So by doing this here, I'm just setting all the variables that I need for later on. I'm then going to go and get my password and set the credentials. Now, I have 2 areas of credentials, as I say, the admin password for SQL Server and how I'm going to connect to the portal. So here is how I'm getting my passwords and usernames for those. This next block is just where I'm going to get the subscription ID and tenant ID. As I said, I've stored them in files rather than putting them in the database. If I was doing this for real, they would be stored quite safely in the database, and I'd probably encrypt the passwords and leave them in the database as well. The next thing I need to do is look to see whether I've got a connection to my Azure portal. If I have, great, and if I haven't, then it will ask me to open one. So all this simply does is checks whether I've got a connection or not. So I'm going to run that, and I've already got connection, so it's not asking me for any further information. The next thing I have to do, the next functions are all ones that are all built in PowerShell functions, the AZ module. So for all the objects, we need to check whether it exists, and if it doesn't, we create it. So first comes first, we need to check for a resource group. So if we don't have a resource group, we'll create it using the new AZ resource group with the resource group name we've said and the Azure region. And if you want to confirm that, we can do that down here with resource group name is Australia East test. So the locale name minus spaces, and the Azure region is Australia East. So we'll kick this off and get that running. Then we have to open up the firewalls to allow us in. So the first thing I do is say, what is my current firewall IP address? And there might be some other firewalls that I want to open up as well. So I will do that. And you can see here that it's getting my current IP, and then I'm creating some firewall rules. As I say, you can, if you know your IP range for the company you're in, you can use that. If there's any other IP addresses that you need to allow access to, you can do that here. You also need to set the IP range in the master database to allow you in as well. So once that's finished running, I will run that. Once we've created our resource group, and in here, we've created our server, then we need to create the database. So we're calling it the database name we've set, which was My Sports, and we're checking whether it exists. And if it doesn't, we will create it. And my previous step is taking a while. I suppose it is creating a SQL server, so that might take a minute or two. And as you can see now in the bottom of the screen, we have now created our server. Is it going to allow me to do this? Yes, it is. So we've created a server called Australia East Server in the Australia East resource group in the Australia East location, and the login is admin user. And it's opened up these firewalls. You can see that it's allowed them in. I now need to run that one, which is allowing it for master, and then we want to create the database. And while that's running, let's look at the next bit of code. So the next part is setting up the repo. So what we're doing now is we want to build the schema. So we've told it where our repo is in the source directory path, but the way I've set up my repos is I have a separate repo for each database. So what I'm saying is source control repo is where my source controlled files are in the database folder of the name of the database. Once we've set that, we need to see whether we're using the DLM database functions to look to see if we can connect. We're going to test our connection, and then we're going to use it to sync our schema. So here, testDB variable is looking to see if we have a connection to that SQL server. If we do, we test it. And if it's tested okay, then we can sync. Now, before I run that, I am just going to have a look here, and you can see that we've now created a database called My Sports. As you can see, it doesn't take very long to do, and if I was to run this function in one go, it would be very fast. It's slow because I'm running it line by line. But now we will let it go away and build our schema. Now, obviously, you've probably noticed I do have this in a try catch, and we do allow writing of errors. Excuse me a minute, just have a sip of water. So once that starts running, it will have a block up on the screen showing you how far it's going once it starts doing the sync. But while it's running, we'll move on to the populate setup data and start having a look at that. Now, these function variables are all almost identical as to the previous one. A lot of the code is the same because, as I say, I want to be able to run them individually or one after the other. One thing that is different with this is this one variable called source data locale ID. Now, what we wanted to be able to do is create a test environment using data from a different region. So, for example, it could be that we wanted a UK test environment that we put the Australian data in so that we could test it on a test version of the application and make sure that everything was exactly as we wanted. So in this way, we can create multiple regions with any data from any region. We could be testing new data that's being deployed, and we know it's going to go to the USA, but actually we want to test it locally before we deploy. So that's what we can do. So in here, if you don't put anything in that variable, it will use the locale ID. If you do, then it will use that data. But in here, as you can see, I'm using them both the same. I'm building locale ID 5, and the source data is from 5. And if you saw the blobs flashing across the screen just now, you'll see it's now synced on my schema, which is great. So before we start actually building data, we will jump back into SQL Server and we'll see the environment that's been built. Now this is where it tests the speed of my internet connection. Here we go. So we're now connecting to the SQL Server. And if we look, we've got a My Sports database. And it's got should have all the tables in it, but all those tables are going to be empty. There we go, we've got all the table. And if we now have a look at our My Sports database with the build product table, and it is completely empty. So we know we've built everything the way that we want it, and now we need to populate it for those 3 tables. So let's go back to PowerShell and we will actually start running that. So we've loaded our variables. Do that again. I think I ran that, but just to check. And then we're going to update our source locale ID based on whether we've got anything our source data location. We need to load our functions again. We need to get a locale specific information again. I'm not going through these in detail. We've already done this. We need to get our passwords again. We need to check whether we're connected. We need to open up our firewalls. Again, that's already been done. So this part, whilst we have rerun it, which we would in the real world, it's very, very fast. Now this is where the code starts changing. So we have to get our list of tables that we're deploying. As I said, I created a very simple store procedure to do it, and I've also created a very simple function. So the get tables function, all it does is says, okay, go and get me the output of the get tables store procedure. So we'll run that, and then we'll see what it's returned. Now, if you want to look at all the additional functions, all my code is in my GitHub repo, and there will be a link to that in the slides at the end of the session. So you can see here, we've got build product category, and build product subcategory. Now, this next bit is in a for each loop, so I'm not going to be able to run it line by line. We'll have to wait and run it all in one go. But what this does is loop through those 3 tables or any other tables we've got. Now, a little bit of background in how this all works together. What I wanted to do was have the ability to insert new rows, make changes to rows, but not to delete. I didn't want to have fresh data every time. I wanted to make sure that we only made changes that were necessary. So what I did, my decision, there's probably other ways of doing it, but this was my way of doing it, was we have our build version of the table. So we've got build product. And what I've done in here is we create a copy in a copied schema. So all the data that we've currently returned from executing our store procedure, which we will in a minute, gets stored and deploys to a version of the table called copied.product. It then dynamically compares the copied.product with the build.product, and it inserts new rows and it updates rows that have changed, and that's all it does. So this next code is how it builds that and gets all that information. So we loop through the 3 tables and we set the table name to uppercase. And then we have to start building what we've called that store procedure. So what we're saying is replace the schema name of build dot to build dot get underscore build underscore and then the product name. So what that's going to do is automatically change the name of the table to the name of the store procedure, but we're setting it into this proc variable. We also need to pass in the parameters that we've stored in that store procedure. So proc becomes the name of the store procedure plus locale ID is equal to, and the source data locale ID we labeled above. And then the next block of code here executes that and stores the result in the result variable. It then tells us how many rows. So we had a look when we ran the script earlier, we saw there was 97 rows in the product table, and this will return the number of rows, and we use that for checking later on. We then need to get the name of the build version of the table. So again, we're going to set build table is equal to table caps. Sorry, the build table needs to be no schemaized. We just want the table name without the schema. So what we're going to call the build table is the table name without the schema. So we're replacing build dot with nothing. So it'll just be the table name without the schema. The next thing we have to do is check that we don't already have a version of the copied table in there. Now this should tidy up after itself, but in case it doesn't, we do a double check. And if that copied dot product table is there, we remove it. Line 129 then builds a version of the table called copy dot, in our case product, and populates it with the data that's in our result variable. So we have our set copy to start comparing to. Now, the next chunk of code dynamically builds the join between the copied version of the table and the build version of the table. It gets all the column names and it joins on the primary key. And if there's no primary key, it joins on the first column. And the where clause is all the column names compared to each other. So we can check whether those columns have got different data in them. Again, if you want to look at this line by line, my Git repo is going to be available for you afterwards. So we get all our columns, we get all our joins. This is a huge swathe of code, and it's very difficult to go through line by line. So I would explain, as I say, this is what it does. It joins the two together, and you can have a look at it in slow time. And it does its comparison, and it builds the build version of the table with all the new data, and then if the row counts match, it drops the schema version. You can see here we're dropping that copy schema, which then gets rid of the table. So let's run that, and it will take a minute or two to run. Okay, so while that's running, let's go and have a look at, go back to SQL Server and have a look at how we can make changes now after the event. So let's consider that you now realize that you want to add in a column called country built in the product table. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing we need to do is make the change in the My Sports table. I'm not going to run this until my other script is finished, but we're just going to go through it now. Then we need to source control it. Then we need to add that column to the build.product table. Actually, I can run that part because that's not going to affect anything. So, F5. I don't know if anyone else finds, but when I'm jumping between PowerShell and SQL Server, the amount of times I'm in SQL Server and I hit F8 and go wonder why nothing's happened. It's very annoying. So in My Sports, we've added in the country built column. So now we need to add that into source control. So we go onto My Sports and we click on sports control, source control. Nothing's changed. Yes, it has. Let's have a look. Refresh you, and we've got our country built there. So let's go back in here. That's very weird how it's not noticed that, but we should now be able to push that up and make the change in source control. The next thing we have to do is alter the hub version of the table, which we can do. And then we update the hub version of the table, which I can also do. And what I'm doing is saying the country built is in the UK. And if we have a look in here, you can see, I don't know why I did that. Then we need to change the store procedure. And what we've done is added the country built to the bottom of it, which I'll run when it's finished doing the populate of the data. But that's as simple as it is to make changes. We go back to PowerShell and see how that's going. And now we've executed this and we can see that we've got all of our data has been updated, but our country built is empty because we've just built that and we haven't changed it. We haven't executed since we did it. So let's go and do that. But before we do that, I just need to amend the store procedure so that we tell it to do that. So to do this, what I need to do is I'm just going to run the two functions. So this function will, the first part will add in a new column and the second part will build it. So we run the first one and it should run a lot quicker second time round because it's already, the objects already exist, and you can see it's very rapidly gone down to the sync part. So now it's just syncing it. So I'm going to leave this to run. I'll give it a couple of minutes, then I'll come back and run the data, and we can check it afterwards. So while that's going, let's go back to our slide deck. So as I said previously, the Azure information that you need is to get the region information, you use get-az location. And these are links to places where you can look at pricing calculators as to which tier you want your information in. So what have we done? We've built a MySports repo, which contains all our schema, and we've populated and built a hub database. We built a resource group, and we've built a SQL database, and we've pushed data in there. And that is exactly what we needed. As we said earlier, we couldn't use replication mirroring. We didn't need to. We've done it a different way around. Now, hopefully, if I go back to my PowerShell, this is finished. Yes, it has. So now if I run the populate, now this will take the same amount of time as it did previously because it's got the same amount of work to do. It's still got to compare copied to build and make sure everything's right. But you can see here that it's rapidly going through it. And the block there here at this bottom part of the window is showing us it's 92% complete because it's obviously doing a comparison. We've got no errors. That's good. That's what I like to see. And that has done. So if we go back to SQL Server now, sorry, I do appear to be jumping around quite a lot. Hopefully, fingers crossed, yep, we've got our UK in the country built. So you can see we've very rapidly created an environment. We've populated it with data, and I've just realized why it wasn't the source control was coming up with anything. I'd obviously already created that column and not just added it. So apologies for that. But as you can say, we can add in data after the event very rapidly, and we could change it as well. I could go in there and say, actually, make that to be Australia, and it would update it. So if we go back to our slide deck, thank you for listening to me. I've been Annette Allen. I am Mrs. Father Jack on Twitter. You can email me, and this is where my GitHub repo is. Thank you for listening to me, and this video will be available on YouTube after 2 weeks. Thank you very much for attending.